Could you say your name
Christopher Kang,
and what do you do for a living?
National Director of the National Council on Asia Pacific American. My
Yeah, so my parents are both from Korea, and they both came
Right.
to this country at the same time. Actually, my mom came to the United States first. She actually came to the United States while
Right.
my dad was still studying in Korea
Uh-huh.
to learn about mobility techniques and to learn how people in the
Mhm.
United States who were visually impaired or were blind got around and sort of how they navigated. And so she actually was one of the first people in Korea to teach other visually impaired people there sort of how to use a cane and how to get around in that way. So she came to the United States, studied for I think less than a year, and then came back to Korea to help my dad and be with him. And then when my dad came to the United States, the University of Pittsburgh, he came on a Rotary Foundation ambassadorial scholarship. So my parents both came to this country at that time. And so it's interesting. As you might imagine, a lot of the attention and focus has been on my dad and his career. He actually ended up doing a lot of international disability advocacy work.
Right.
He was appointed by President George W. Bush to be on the National Council on Disability.
That's great.
So there's no question my dad's done some amazing things,
Right.
but none of that would have been possible without my mom, and none of that would have been possible without her effort, her insight, her passion as well. And so I think for me, sort of growing up in a house with two people who were really doing a lot of civil rights advocacy, and yet we're just my mom and dad, just had sort of an innate impact, I think, on sort of how I see the world. My parents sort of taught me Korean history and culture, food. A little bit of language isn't good.
Oh, a little
But like once I left my front door, I didn't want to stick out. Like kids don't want to stand out in a way. Like I was already, and in particular for me too, I was already the kid who had a blind dad. Like how many different ways are you going to be different? And so you more likely try to fit in. And I think fitting in is this sort of this dual identity, or what they talk about like code switching, right? Like how are you an Asian American in one space and not in another? And how does that work for especially being a kid growing up?
I guess.
Sure. I mean, like people would call me chink. They would sort of talk to you in this like gibberish that they would pretend was Chinese, setting aside that I was Korean. And there was like the kids would run around the playground with slanty eyes. Like there's all of that sort of that makes you feel uncomfortable at best. But it's not as if they only bullied me because I was Asian. It was just the way they expressed the bullying, or was because was to focus on my identity, whereas they picked on other kids, and they picked on other kids for other various reasons too. And so it's a very different way of sort of being singled out. It was interesting. Like on the one hand, I think my parents wanted us to assimilate and be American.
Right.
On the other hand, like I spent a lot of time doing studying. It was very, it's sort of what your stereotypical, or what you sort of think of as stereotypical growing up with Asian parents. There's a lot of math, a lot of like classes, a lot of like reading, a lot of stuff very focused on academics that didn't actually leave much time to hang out with your friends. It sort of is the idea of like playing outside was almost too frivolous, and so it did a little bit, but not much.
So.
I was like, I have the benefit of being a second generation kid who sort of has all of the benefits and advantages that go with that, including having a completely different way of understanding how kids can grow up and grow and develop, and sort of having seen my friends grow up and what their lives were like, or then meeting other people in college and in professional life, and the neighbors down the street. Like it's just a different world that you have a lot of different perspectives to rely on. And like anything, when you have a diversity of opinions, a diversity of insight, you're better able to craft your own way. And so I think that I have a wider social network, a wider set of experiences, friends, intersections in life that's why I will raise my daughter differently. But if I had been in my parents' shoes, I sort of say it jokingly, like, who am I to judge? But really, like, who am I to judge? That there's no question that they thought that they were doing the best thing for me, and at the end of the day, I turned out all right. So I think that they did a pretty good job, whether or not. The interesting thing about the model minority myth is that it's based on a couple things. One, it's based on the aggregate. You look on average at the average family income. You look at the average education attainment, and sort of this is built on this myth that one, the average is actually representative of all Asian Americans, despite the fact that we represent almost 50 different ethnicities and sort of a lot of different experiences, including immigration experiences. The experiences of my parents coming here, even my dad having a disability, was coming here to get a PhD. He had it's a much different experience than people who come to this country in that immigration path than people who come here as refugees. And sort of you can't lump us all together. And so the model minority myth obscures the differences within our sort of the broad ethnicity, but then also, importantly, it sort of serves as a wedge between Asian Americans and other communities of color. There's this implicit or actually sort of explicit notion that if we're a model minority, then what are other people of color? What are the non-models, and why are they not models? And it's this notion that it's because somehow Asian Americans value family and education more than other people of color that makes us successful. We're harder working, and it's like that. Not only is that so racist on so many different levels, but it's just this idea. But it perpetuates it to the extent that then you also have a lot of Asian Americans who come here, and again, they experience racism and discrimination and prejudice at so many different levels. That they almost aspire to be the model minority, right? Like becoming the model minority is in some ways a signature or a sign of having made it, of having achieved something in and of itself. And I think that those who sort of aspire to that as a goal don't understand that, one, that's not actually achieving anything, and that we're still also face this perpetual foreigner stereotype that prevents us from often being accepted as sort of truly American. This very notion that people will ask me where I'm from, and they don't like the answer Chicago, or the fact that it really it's about the model minority myth is about pitting us against our own community for those who are not as successful, or against other communities of color. It's really it sounds nice. Like, who wouldn't want to be a model? Who doesn't want to be a model citizen? Like, why wouldn't you want to be a model minority? And yet, it has such a disastrous impact on race relations as a whole, but also on the way we see ourselves as a community, that I think deconstructing that and breaking that down is a huge part of where our community needs to go in building power, building solidarity, and really achieving racial justice and equity. So NCAPA is a coalition of 34 national AA and HPI organizations. And what we are seeking to do is to provide a bigger platform for our organizations and our communities, in particular on the national scale. And so doing federal policy advocacy and sort of changing the narrative and really thinking about how Asian Americans are thought of and discussed and considered, if we're considered at all, in a lot of these policy debates and just in media. I think one of the challenges, you look like poll after poll that sort of purports to tell you what Americans think, American views on X or Y or Z. Sometimes they'll break it out by race, and they'll tell you how African Americans view this question, or Latinos view this question. They'll almost never break it out and explain what the Asian American view is on this question. And the argument from their perspective is that there's not enough Asian Americans to poll, as if somehow the 20 million of us are hiding somewhere. But what it does is it helps feed this narrative that, one, we don't have opinions,
two, our opinions don't matter.
Mhm.
And C, then there's nobody to talk about what our views are. Like if the story is about a poll and the results of a poll and our data is not even included, then of course we're not going to be included in the study.
Right.
Environment. It's about the toxicity. It's about if you're not a white person, or in particular a white male, it's almost like trying to drag us back to the founding of this country, which some people would argue is not a bad thing. I think those people who are not white male property owners might argue that it was a little bit limiting, right? But it's this idea that if you're not a white male, that you're not American, right? And we have to reclaim that narrative of who is an American and who helped build this country and what makes this country stronger. And so that attacks on Muslims are really attacks on Asian Americans, not only because Asian Americans, they're Muslims who are Asian American. Bangladesh is the largest country, has the largest Muslim population in the world, but also because that's the kind of othering and exclusion and prejudice and discrimination that we literally saw as a community with the Chinese Exclusion Act, right, of 1882, the idea that you would discriminate based on where somebody comes from. We've seen this story before. This Muslim ban, the second version of the Muslim ban, reads a lot to our community like the third version of the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? And so, or you look, obviously, the internment or incarceration of 120,000 Japanese Americans during World War II. Like, there are these experiences and these parallels that I think resonate with our community because we've seen them before. We can see them happening again. One of the things we try to do in the Asian American advocacy community, and as we talk about building solidarity and sharing our stories and telling, educating on our history, is this notion of never again. But never again only works if people understand what happened in the first place. Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest piece of this is sort of knowing your history, knowing our history, but also this country's history. Like if you walked out of Professor Nash's class into your cafeteria and asked how many people have heard of, hopefully how many people have heard of like the incarceration of Japanese Americans in World War II, hopefully that's a lot of people, but then ask them how many of them have heard of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, right? And whatever hands are up, those are probably hands that would not have been up 6 months ago, right? Like one of the things that I've heard and experienced myself throughout my 15 years in government is that the Asian American and Pacific Islander community is always a growing community. It's always on the verge of. It's, soon we'll be able to really achieve our power. And I really wanted to be part of this effort to, if we're at this tipping point, to push us over, right? To figure out how can we be more effective advocates for our community, and having seen from the inside how policies and regulations and issues are dealt with in government, being able to take those experiences, come out here and say, if we want to affect change, this is how things are really done, and this is where we can really impact things. And let's bring our community together to have a bigger and stronger and more effective voice than we've ever had before. And so for me, it's that possibility, again, because our community is sort of writ large, the AA and HPI community in this country, but also on the advocacy side, in a sort of smaller scale, we're at the cusp of really being able to make a big difference in this country for ourselves, but then also for this broader racial justice movement. As you look to 2040, when a majority of this country is going to be people of color, that's only true if Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are viewed as people of color. On the one hand, of course, we're people of color. You walk down the street and you're reminded you're a person of color. And yet, we don't always view ourselves that way. Again, the people who even within our community, who either because of their own experiences or because they don't understand the history of the African American community, for whatever reason, I think we have to acknowledge there's anti-blackness within the Asian American community, or maybe it's because they've bought into the model minority myth. Asian Americans themselves don't always want to identify as being people of color. I mean, goes back to the conversation about college admissions. If the people are saying decline the state, it's because they don't want to state that they're a person of color, in particular Asian American. And at the same time, there are people, white people, who sort of don't want to view us as people of color either, so that they can co-opt us. And so I think there is this element here that as we go into these next couple decades and build power and really seek to achieve racial justice, what role are we as Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders going to play? Both literally the advocacy community, but writ large in this country, where are we going to find ourselves? And it's that opportunity to build power and voice and strength that really drew me out to this community and to the work that I'm doing today.